of all of these animals on the screen have been found in the same rock layers as dinosaur bones, and they're also alive today.
Some creatures have gone extinct, and some haven't. That doesn't make dragons real.
Our culture today is fascinated by dragons. Franchise box office earnings for How to Train a Dragon is $2.2 billion.
Barbie is $1 billion franchise. It's not popular because Barbie's a real living doll living in a Barbie world.
Instead of trusting man's word, who doesn't know everything, hasn't always been there, I'd rather trust the words of someone who's always been there, who knows everything, and who never lies.
Well, you're not going to trust a collection of texts written by men throughout history, then, are you? As far as I can tell, there is one accurate notion presented in Joel's entire presentation, and that is that science updates regularly. I like pop science. I grew up very much in the dinosaur era. In my opinion, the best way to get this and any kind of news without falling prey to the bias of some group like Answers in Genesis is using Ground News, today's sponsor. This came up for me a few days ago because it's a UK-themed story. Scottish fossil reveals 410 million-year-old life form unlike anything on Earth. Immediately challenging Joel's young Earth creationist worldview. The best thing about using Ground News is how swift and simple the overview is, how many news sources there are, how many lean left, how many lean right, the bias distribution of the specific sources. I would say probably most importantly, the bias distribution and the factuality rating are probably the two most important to me. Ownership is also really interesting. But we can see that on this story, 89% of the sources are high factuality. And then as we scroll down, we can choose left, center, and right-leaning sources. That makes it so useful, particularly to me when I'm making content to research a story. Even just the headlines can give you a clue as to the bias. So if you look at the left-leaning articles, we've got the fossil reveals an extinct evolutionary way of life. On the right, the language is very different. They think they have found. Scientists claim. It becomes immediately obvious looking at the headlines on the left and the right that the right has a less trusting approach to scientific discovery than the left does. To subscribe to Ground News, go to groundnews.com/Emma Thorne or scan the QR code on screen, get 40% off your Vantage plan, which gives you unlimited access to all features. Make sure you use my link when you check it out. That gets you your 40% off, but also helps me out. Most importantly, you are helping an organisation that is trying to make the news more transparent. Plus, you're becoming more aware of the bias in your own news consumption. It's a win-win. Thank you so much to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Hello, lovely people. My name is Emma. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you are new. I hope you don't find that tiny bit of sunlight too distracting. Just don't look at it. Swear jar update if you are new here. I have a swear jar now at the end of a video. The swears go to charity. It is a public pot. You can donate to it if you want to for the charity Calm. Starting this video with a swear because I missed one last week while I was recording. Anyway, good news everyone. Dragons are real. Long thought to be simply mythological creatures, Answers in Genesis have a new video explaining to us the mind-blowing physical evidence of dragons being real. Let's not beat around the bush. I want to know the truth.
I believe that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time.
You're an idiot.
The fact that we know that pterodactyls did exist, that's cool.
Right.
It would be way cooler if they existed with people.
Right.
I mean, if there was any credibility to the idea of dragons being real, there'd be some scientific evidence. Well, believe it or not, we have found physical evidence of every one of these dragons.
Wow, every one of these modern drawings of dragons. I don't know, some of them might be AI hallucinations. Somehow they were all real in ancient times. Okay, I'm being facetious here. Presumably that selection of, 8 dragons, 12 dragons? Presumably those are like a list he's compiled from, ancient sources, biblical stories. I think it's a great thing for Answers in Genesis to use a clip of Joe Rogan saying, "I'd be so cool if dinosaurs and man coexisted." Because A, Joe Rogan's an idiot. Hopefully, that has immediately turned away some of the few people that were going to Answers in Genesis thinking that they were legitimate truth tellers and scientific minds. And 2, because what a hilarious thing to just pick a popular podcast where someone says, "Wouldn't it be cool?" and use that at the start of your video. Imagine if the Flintstones was biographical. That'd be pretty sweet. This is an AI-generated map. What's Frunwund? I didn't realize my family was from Griever. They couldn't even get a real map of the world. God, I hate Answers in Genesis. They're so shit.
hundreds of dragon legends from around the world and all throughout recorded history. Legends are rooted in reality.
Are legends all rooted in reality? Mind you, these are the kind of people that believe the Great Flood, the global Great Flood, was real, and that Noah's Ark was real, and they have to rewrite evolutionary theory to make that so, and that the Earth is like 6,000 years old. All of those things being disproved by a whole variety of different sciences. So I am not principally, because, I haven't studied this, but I'm not principally against the notion that a dragon in, some ancient text does not really come from or is not really a reference to a big lizard. A bit like the whole unicorn in the Bible thing. Interestingly, only translated as unicorn in the King James Version out of all modern translations. It's more likely, based on the original Hebrew, that they were referring to like a large ox or something like that, some other horned animal like that. But I am not in principle against the notion that the unicorn in the Bible was actually referring to a rhino, because people in the ancient world knew about rhinos, and that's a real animal. So if that's the argument for dragons are real, I have no principal problem with that. If, and I know this is the case because I know what Answers in Genesis and their museums say about dragons, if they're going to say that dragons are real and dragons exist in these ancient religious texts, therefore, because there's texts saying that people fought dragons, dinosaurs and man coexisted, that then is too many leaps too far for me to get behind.
I found this little book called Sea Serpents of Coastal New England. And it was part of the New England Folklore series, is what they called it. But none of the accounts in this little book read like fiction. They're all written like eyewitness accounts of things that actually happened with original published dates. And
well, they must be real then. There's a kind of weird idea around the creativity and the intelligence of ancient peoples that they couldn't have made this up. I've heard, I think Answers in Genesis regulars say that the story of Jesus Christ couldn't have been made up. And I think they forget that ancient peoples were not very different from us. We've socially, culturally, technologically evolved, but actually up here, we're not very different at all. And people were creatively writing things, people were spreading hoaxes, people were creating work that was not intended to mislead, but was, meant to be satirical, fantastical. It says something about the reader to me, that you would read a load of folklore and be like, they couldn't have made this up. This sounds like eyewitness accounts. Like, you can't write from a first-person perspective in a fantasy setting. Dragons aren't real. Man and dinosaur didn't coexist. Mermaids were just manatees seen by very ill, drunken sailors.
And some of the stories sound kind of like maybe a giant eel or a sea snake, but there are a couple that sound like something else. So let's read a couple of these. I used to laugh when they talked about sea serpents, but when I saw this one, I was convinced.
This writer interviewed Captain Albert Franklin Pierce at that time 92 years old, so I'm sure his memory of the event is spotless. Captain Pierce was a long-time lobsterman and Grand Banks fisherman. Let's look him up. Captain Albert Franklin Pierce. As far as I can tell, this New England folklore series is the only reference to this story in existence. So I can't check it to verify, which is really handy for Answers in Genesis, but alright, let's listen.
At least 60 feet long, and he had fins 5 to 6 feet high out of the water. I saw him for about 5 minutes while I was hauling. And then this story. They were surprised when a large animal thrust its turtle-shaped head about 6 to 8 feet out of the water, remaining 5 to 10 seconds, and then went down. This continued for a matter of 2 hours, which it was chased and shot at with a Ballard rifle. The distance at which it was observed ranged from 40 to 160 yards. The color was black, whitish beneath. No scales were noted. The diameter of the neck was about 1.5 feet, while at the water it seemed to broaden with the appearance of flippers.
What do we think? Slightly drunken sailors with bad eyesight seeing whales?
You might know some people who were alive in 1939. That's crazy. What do we make of this, right?
Nothing, because we can't verify it. That's interesting. It's an interesting story that they told. I can't even check that person really told that story. let alone verify their story. This is the problem with Answers in Genesis framing itself as investigatory and scientific, because they just throw shit out that is like, well, somebody said this. So, I mean, what are we going to make of that? That's crazy. You can't just say that's crazy and it be true. That information is not verifiable. It's not falsifiable, which is an important part of the scientific method. So I'm waiting for the physical evidence that we can actually test before we take this man seriously. Who is this guy? Joel Lineweber. Or Lineweber? He's American, so probably Lineweber. I don't know. Let's find out what his expertise is. Joel is a gifted designer and technology expert. Not gonna lie, I kind of thought he might have some... Usually the people they get in have some tenuous link to the field of science that they're claiming to be an expert about. He's a designer and technology expert. Why, Answers in Genesis, would we listen to this man telling us that dragons are real? Who opened with, after the stupid opening images, and Joe Rogan saying, wouldn't it be cool if, he's opened with some accounts from hundreds of years ago that we can't, well, one from more recently, but from many, many years ago that we can't falsify, and therefore are meaningless to us as evidence. Why would we listen to this man? Because he has such a heart for people and he loves to share Christ using those values. That's what makes you an expert on Answers in Genesis. There are an enormous number of accounts of mystical happenings. How many people have seen ghosts? How many people have seen, or claim to have seen, mermaids, ghouls, dragons, appearances of the Lord Jesus Christ? If these things have happened throughout history, and now we're in the modern day, a day when almost every person, okay, in most places, almost every person has access to a video and audio recording device. Oh, now that's coming through on my nose? That's definitely going to be distracting. We live in a world where it is so easy to capture visual evidence. And then we have amazing developments in scientific study and investigation that can then explore those things. And still, there is no shred of evidence. Okay, it's telling that Joel has opened with very old anecdotes, the anecdotes which I can't even verify using the enormous human database that is the internet. It doesn't mean anything if there's no physical evidence.
Movies is How to Train a Dragon. And the animated series was so successful that they've already made a live-action remake.
Matt worked on the live-action remake of How to Train Your Dragon. Pretty cool, right?
And total of franchise box office earnings for How to Train a Dragon is $2.2 billion, not counting merchandise sales. So very popular, right?
Yeah. Barbie is a billion-dollar franchise. It's not popular because Barbie's a real living doll living in a Barbie world with Ken and Cindy and everyone else. Things can be popular without being What argument is he trying to make here? This fantastical thing is really popular and makes a lot of money, so it must be real. A Game of Thrones isn't a documentary, my friend.
Popular that they're now opening the Isle of Berk at Universal Orlando. So you can
I'd love to go to that.
See dragons
That looks
and
awesome.
see the island of Berk. But our culture today is fascinated by dragons, right? We're obsessed with them. They're mysterious, intriguing, dangerous.
Yes. None of those things make it real. Skip to the end. I'm going to skip ahead because what's the point of this? Just because something fascinates us doesn't mean that it's real. This is like when Christians like this say, millions of people believe in Jesus. Okay, it was common sense, it was common knowledge. People had a fascination with the idea that the sun revolved around the earth for a long time. That was still wrong. This argument from popularity is not too far from the argument from common sense, is a logical fallacy. Because it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any impact on the argument. There is nothing falsifiable about that. This is pointless. This is just designed to make you go, yeah. It's like not even circumstantial evidence. I know we're not on a court of law, but that's the best analogy I can think of to describe it. It's like not even circumstantial evidence being piled up just to make whatever they're going to say later, the legitimate bit, sound more compelling. It doesn't mean anything that we love dragons. There's loads of media about fairies. The fairy industry has made who knows how many millions of dollars. Does that mean that fairies are real? No. Look how much common media there is about vampires. And okay, again, some Christians think vampires are real. Maybe Joel would be like, yeah, that's because vampires are real. But the rest of us who have fully functioning brains and have not been indoctrinated into this bizarre, quasi-scientific religious cult, we know that that doesn't make them real. Vampires aren't real. Werewolves aren't real. Just because they're popular things in our culture doesn't make them real. Kermit the Frog is very popular. He and his Muppety friends have made a ton of money in box office sales and things like that. He's not a real talking frog. Frogs don't really talk. They're not made of felt and sit like 1.5 feet tall. It's fiction. It's fantasy. My point being, just because it's cool doesn't mean it's real. We'd all love to think Bigfoot's real. We'd love to find a dragon. When I was a kid, I was desperate to find a fairy. I'd love to have found a fairy at the bottom of the garden like they did in my books. But I never did because fairies aren't real. It doesn't matter that it's popular. What a moron.
Like few creatures can. They're incorporated into many of our favorite stories. Maybe one of your favorite stories is up there. And it's not just modern stories that dragons are part of.
Yeah.
Ancient dragon legends keep coming up too.
Well, I feel like you've got that the wrong way around. It's not like coincidentally the concept of dragons existed in the past and the present. That's a continuation. Look, he's quoted Joe Rogan on the screen. Every picture of Joe Rogan from his podcast is deeply unflattering. Why are we using even answers in Genesis who are categorically stupid, right, and dishonest? I'm finding it baffling that even they are using Joe Rogan as a reference. For what? For the fact that we think it would be cool if the Flintstones was real? That's an insane way of making an argument. Nothing he has said so far is compelling in even the smallest way.
Joe Rogan is an infamous podcast.
Skip the end.
How big crocodiles can get today, the largest crocodile.
My god, he's actually using stuff that stoned off his face idiot Joe Rogan has said and saying, well, he's probably right. Yes, there were big ancient crocodiles. That doesn't mean dragons are real. This is upsetting.
People use this word dragon and variations of it. And many of them have similar characteristics and descriptions. What are the chances of that happening by accident?
So, okay, this is another common biblical literalist kind of thing. What are the chances that these stories, the creatures in these different stories, could contain similar characteristics? It doesn't necessarily fit this idea, and it depends on the time and the place, okay? But earlier than clearly Joel thinks, trade existed, and cultural hubs existed that shared information and technology. It is not that every culture that has ever written about dragons is completely isolated from other cultures and the past. Probably part of the reason that those descriptions, are shared is because those stories were shared. They were known about. It is also completely feasible that different cultures that didn't interact wrote fantasy works about big lizards, because dragons share the characteristics of real animals. So maybe they saw a crocodile and wrote about a fantastical version of a crocodile. Maybe they saw a whale and wrote about a fantastical version of a whale. Or whatever, lizard. Or imagine if that lizard was 100 feet bigger. These things don't exist in isolation. It means nothing that those similarities, he's not presented any evidence yet, presented the similarities, because then we could start looking them up and find out where the influences were. It doesn't mean anything that, this culture described an ancient big lizard dragon thing, and this culture also described a dragon in a similar way.
For example, the Chinese zodiac. Now, I'm not a proponent of astrology, but it's really interesting that the Chinese zodiac has 11 animals that are real, and then the 12th one is a dragon.
Does it matter if ancient Chinese people believed that dragons were real? In fact, in China, they believed that the Earth was not round for a long time. Just because the people in that culture at that time believed that does not mean that it is true. A baby could understand that. There's still a light reflection, but hopefully it's not as bad. Okay, sometimes I like to let some real daylight in here, but artificial light is the way forward, I guess. Yeah, just because a lot of people thought it doesn't make it true. It's interesting how people in the West will manipulate this kind of mysticism we associate with, like, ancient Asian thoughts, and how we apply some sort of, like, special spirituality to that, and we'll use that, even while being the sort of person that says, well, you can't believe that because it's pagan, it's heretical. Obviously, I'm not a proponent of astrology, but one of the astrological signs.
Why would they use one mythological beast?
Why not? The answer is because they did believe in dragons, and they believed that dragons were powerful forces. Again, that doesn't make dragons real.
The dragon, when it eats fruit, swallows endive juice. It has been seen in the act.
The actual quote is, the Draco, and it wasn't referring to a mystical dragon, it was a serpent or a snake. I'm pretty convinced that the reason people like this prefer the King James Version is because it translates stuff in, sometimes in what you could almost view as a manipulative way, or it's used in a manipulative way. The King James Bible does stuff with translation that none of the other modern, like popular modern Bibles do, because it's not the most accurate actual translation, it's the most literal translation. And he's doing that here with this Aristotle quote. He's abusing a particular translation. He has either found a certain translation or translated this himself in a manipulative way to suggest that Aristotle believed in mythical dragons. No, he didn't. He was an observer of the material world, a meticulous observer of the real physical world. When he is noting here, when a Draco has eaten much fruit, it seeks the juice of the bitter lettuce. It has been seen to do this. Aristotle has not seen a dragon, because dragons aren't real. Aristotle here is reporting that he or other people that he, enough sources or people that he trusts, have observed serpents, snakes, theoretically self-medicating, seeking out, instinctively finding ways to settle their stomachs, so to speak. He's not claiming here that there is a dragon. That's made up. Joel has deliberately chosen a quote, or quoted this himself, in a way that uses the term dragon when that's absolutely not what was intended. This is manipulative.
Still a residuum sufficient to prevent modern zoologists from denying the possibility that some such creature may after all exist. So even as early as 1902, in a reputable publication, they were saying, yeah, it's possible, maybe it existed.
Yeah, because you can't disprove it. Ergo, the point, the connection that you're supposed to make is, at the moment, this is not, say it with me everyone, falsifiable. Just like Russell's teapot. We can't disprove Russell's floating space teapot. It's not falsifiable. Therefore, it doesn't matter. It can't form part of our argument. If we're being intellectually honest, Joel isn't.
All these bones of real creatures that have been found, when you put flesh on these bones, they looked a lot like what we expect dragons to look like, don't they?
Well, yeah, but, isn't that an old-fashioned artistic representation? Because what we have when we just stick flesh on bones is a pretty inaccurate portrayal of the real creature. If you just stick flesh on the bones of... In fact, look, we've done this, right? I don't know how to search for this. Here we go. If we drew modern animals the way that we draw dinosaurs, based on bones alone, here we go. There's a swan. There's a hippo. There's a baboon. Slapping skin straight onto the bones of a creature is not an accurate way of representing what it looks like. Everything looks kind of like a dragon if you do that. And through the advancement of science and archaeology and all of those studies that contribute to looking at ancient history, we learn based on, say, things we can learn about their diet, their habitat, etc., that actually there's evidence to support that they look more like this. And this is never just skin slapped on the skeleton. The reason they're all thin and skeletal, dinosaurs in our imaginings of them, is because that is just, well, what does it look like if you put skin onto this skeleton? Most creatures aren't like that.
In fact, scientists even recognize that dinosaurs look like dragons. They look so much like dragons that scientists often include the word dragon in dinosaur names. So here's a list.
It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. You know, some species are discovered and they're named after the person that discovered them. Doesn't mean that that person is, you know, a butterfly or whatever. We knew about the myths and legends of dragons when we named these dinosaurs. So we already had a picture of what a dragon is and descriptions of what a dragon is in our head. And then, you know, they discovered this thing and thought, oh, it looks kind of like a dragon.
Reported carbon-14 in 70 samples that came from fossils, coal, oil, natural gas, and marble, supposedly spanning more than 500 million years, all containing radiocarbon. Diamonds, supposedly 1 to 3 billion years old, similarly yielded radiocarbon. These things are not as old as people think they are.
Suppose it's true. Suppose all of the various dating methods that we use to measure the age of the Earth, as well as, you know, the age of not just creatures, but plants, etc. Suppose that's all wrong and they're not really millions of years old. Where is the proof, the unrelated proof, because these should be two separate things, that therefore they lived 1,000 years ago with man? We would have the evidence if that was so.
How many of you have heard the idea that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago? Right? We've all heard that idea.
I should hope so. It's mainstream science. It ought to be taught in schools. Everyone should have heard that idea.
I want to answer the question of millions of years and address that. But let's start with this question. How long would a species have to be extinct, or be missing, before you know that it's completely extinct?
Remember, Joel, designer. Not a scientist, not an archaeologist, not a paleontologist, not in any one of the many fields of study that disprove his hypotheses, let's call them to be polite. Zero expertise. All of this is disprovable by actual experts. Therefore, off the bat, there is no reason for us to listen to this man and take him seriously. Just a reminder, while he stands, you know, in a professor-looking jumper, I don't know if this man even has a degree in anything.
This furry little guy is a Cuban solenodon, and he was discovered in 1861, presumed to be extinct by 1890, and then later on discovered in 1974 to still be alive. And you might say, that's totally different. That was only like 84 years, right, that they thought he was extinct. Dinosaurs have been extinct for millions of years, you might say.
And he's small, and presumably from a less inhabited region. There have been lots of stories about creatures that we've thought have been extinct and then have, you know, popped up out there in the wild. It's usually because they're pretty small and or live in a habitat that people don't usually occupy.
Interesting about solenodons. They're actually called living fossils. And they're called that because we've found fossils of these solenodons that are said to have lived 30 million years ago. And this is just one example of a living fossil.
Yeah, what's the point? You can't just say, and that's just one example of a living fossil. You need a point. What is that? That doesn't mean that dragons are real. We don't even have evidence that dragons ever existed to say, like, maybe we thought they were extinct and now they're back. This isn't Skyrim. Oh my god, what if Joel has just played Skyrim for the first time and he's like, that's what happened. We thought the dragons were wiped out. We thought St. George slew the last dragon, but actually they're hiding around places and they're not extinct at all. There's particularly a lot of deep sea life that haven't, you know, seemingly evolved for millions of years. I don't understand how that relates to the question of, are dragons real?
Of all of these animals on the screen have been found in the same rock layers as dinosaur bones, and they're also alive today.
Yeah, okay, woolly mammoths are extinct, great wolves, dire wolves are extinct, but they lived at the same time as a lot of creatures that are still not extinct. Dodos are extinct. Some creatures have gone extinct, and some haven't. That doesn't make dragons real. What are you talking about?
Some of these fossils are the same species as the animals alive today. Others are unique species but look remarkably similar to animals alive today.
So
this idea of an age of reptiles is looking less and less accurate. Sometimes we think we know a lot about the past, but if you watch the news and pay attention to science headlines, you'll see something like, this discovery changes everything. And you'll see that almost every week. Something is always coming out and changing.
Yeah, that's what we keep trying to convince you. Because you claim that we have an accurate picture of the past because of the Bible. By you, I'm now saying Answers in Genesis. They're the ones that claim that no, the past is like this and this new science cannot be accurate because we're the ones that say, oh, this new technology has changed our view on this part of history, or we've discovered something that fills in a blank here, like in the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens. Answers in Genesis are the ones that say, no, that cannot be true because it contradicts our very set-in-stone image of the past. You can't just change that to suit you. I hate his smug little face. Look at his smile. What a cock. He's being deliberately intellectually dishonest. He might have convinced himself and been convinced by, the people around him, because a lot of these groups are very cult-like in their tactics and their thinking techniques. And if he grew up indoctrinated into, a very religious upbringing, education, it's quite possible that he believes everything he's saying. He's still, consciously or not, being incredibly manipulative with the information that he shares in order to make this argument compelling. Because if you let the facts speak for themselves, oh look, dragons aren't real. Man and dinosaur didn't coexist.
So, a great example of a living fossil is coelacanth, which is a fish. And fossils of this fish were discovered in the 1800s, and a live one was caught in 1938. 1938.
Yeah, it's a really old species of fish. That doesn't prove dragons are real, you idiot!
50 to 80,000 years old. Anything older than that, and the radiocarbon levels are too low to be detected. So most scientists don't date dinosaur fossils because they assume they won't detect any radiocarbons. But guess what happens when you do date a dinosaur fossil? You find radiocarbon.
As I mentioned earlier, we're not going to do this because this is a huge topic, and carbon dating specifically. Maybe I will do a video on its own. Maybe I'll find a good Answers in Genesis or some similar example of their specific arguments about against radiometric dating. There are lots of different methods of radiometric dating. No method is perfectly accurate. That's why, typically, you will have independent experiments using different methods that all confirm a rough aging. So that's all I'll say for now. Let me know down below if you would like a video on carbon dating specifically, because we're going to skip this bit because this could be this could be enormous. And I want to skip to the next bit, and we have talked about it before. We all know that creationists use ridiculous arguments against carbon dating.
But there's now overwhelming evidence. There are 130 peer-reviewed research papers describing original proteins and biomolecules inside dinosaur bones. A creation scientist from ICR, Institute...
If you're a creation scientist, you're not a scientist. It is interesting that soft tissue has been found in dinosaur bones. This challenges the idea that they completely decay, that they completely degrade. Not that actually they were alive like 100 years ago. That's not what that means. The soft tissue findings are real. The explanations, the possible explanations, range from rapid burial, reactions of iron is a popular one, some chemical cross-linking. This is the Mary Schweitzer thing. That's going to make a lot of people go, oh, because Mary Schweitzer was one of the people that discovered this, and her work has been abused by creationists. And she herself, who pioneered this range of study, trying to prove that there is soft tissue preserved in some of these bones, has been used very much against her will to argue that the bones are not as old as that, therefore they mustn't be as old as we thought. And that's not the case. It is a disservice to her and her work and the work of every scientist, real scientist in that field, that people like Joel, young Earth creationists, keep abusing that work to tell a lie.
So those are my 4 favorite scientific reasons why I believe dinosaurs and humans live together.
I'm glad they were your favorite, but they're not good. They're not scientific reasons. They're just not. You've just manipulated facts to fit your existing beliefs. That's not how we do science.
But I said I was going to share 5 reasons. The 5th reason is the biggest one. It's the best evidence that dinosaurs lived with people. Are you ready?
Yeah, can't wait.
The biggest reason is actually not from science. See, science textbooks, like we just talked about, they change all the time. People make mistakes.
Yeah, and they change all the time because they update to be more correct. They change all the time because they used to say stuff like, the Earth is 6,000 years old because somebody worked out that that's what the Bible probably says. And then we learned some science and updated the textbooks. He's gonna say because the Bible says so and the Bible is immutable, which is what I mentioned earlier, because he's flip-flopped on whether that's the argument we use or not. Oh, I'm just so frustrated. It always winds up being the same thing. Mind-blowing physical evidence. It's these 2 or 3 old theories that we have abused and misused and have already been debunked. Plus, a big helping heapful, big chonked up spoonful of God says so, Bible says so. What a waste of our time.
Instead of trusting man's word, who doesn't know everything, hasn't always been there, I'd rather trust the words of someone who's always been there, who knows everything, and who never lies.
Well, you're not going to trust a collection of texts written by men throughout history, then, are you? They literally change. If you were Greek Orthodox, you would have a very different Bible. The Bible is not God. The Bible is your current specific collection of translations of ancient works. That's not God. That's not infallible. As I have made a video on this channel, highly recommend, by the way, it's a good fun video, the Bible contradicts itself. It does contradict mainstream science. That's why we update the textbooks. You've just identified the flaw in your own motivations, in your own planning. That's why Answers in Genesis is wrong about things like the age of dinosaurs and whether dragons were real, which this hasn't really explained. You are wrong because you have this collection of old texts, the specific translation of specific texts that contradicts mainstream science. And you say, okay, but I believe that this text is completely accurate. So how do I manipulate the science? What do I pick and choose to fit this text? While criticizing the scientific community for the fact that science updates and changes how we think about things. The fact that scientists and historians go, oh, it looks like we might have been wrong about this thing based on, this new evidence. He's saying that that's therefore untrustworthy. We should trust my preferred version of this collection of ancient texts. Some of which we know wasn't written by the author that is attributed to it. Many of the most important early documents which were unauthored, they had their authorship attributed later to make them sound more reliable, much of which is clearly allegorical, which then presents the problem of trying to decide what is and isn't allegorical if you're combining them into one text. There's a million reasons why your interpretation of the Bible, even as a Christian, should be malleable. If you took the approach that science takes of updating the textbooks, this is the most common approach to Jewish scholarship, is to update our interpretations of these ancient texts based on what we know now, and to continuously reevaluate. It's crazy to be like, my book says this, therefore this bit of science is completely fake and not true. But this bit of science that is contributed by the thing that I've said is not true actually means that this other thing that I've made up. And then you got people like Mary Schweitzer being like, that's not what that fucking means. Stop using my work like that. Frustrating. Hate Joel. Still hate Answers in Genesis. It's the most dishonest, ridiculous rehashing of existing ideas. The ideas being completely fantastical and made up. I don't know how many of the people that work for Answers in Genesis have really bought into their own shtick and actually believe what they say, and how many of them are just like, well, this is what we tell people, and this is what we preach, and this is how we earn our living, this is how we make money. Versus how many of them might just be too scared to believe anything else, because they also believe in heaven and hell and an eternal soul, that, believing the wrong thing might damn them forever, and they might just be too scared to consider what is the obvious true alternative, because their minds are so closed. And I find that depressing. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts down below. Super, super annoying stuff. Let me know if you want to go into any more detail on any of the specific stuff that this video covers, because I kept it quite brief because it was a huge amount of nonsense in one video. I can't remember if I swore or I forgot to keep track, so I'll just have a look in editing. If you want to support this channel and what I do here, first of all, please, yes, do leave your thoughts down below. Share the video with a pal. YouTube algorithm has been doing something weird and scary lately, and views have been down for everyone, so if you could support this channel, I would be super grateful. Check out the link to today's sponsor down below. The best way to support this channel and what I do here is via the Patreon. With that, I must give a big old shout out and a thank you to my giant chickens and colossal quackers over on Patreon. Especially Conla. God damn it, Conla. Most importantly, have yourselves a very lovely week, and I will see you really soon.